Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Jim Zogby. As 2011 draws to close, many groups issue top 10 lists. Americans for Peace Now is no exception. Joining me with a rundown of this year's top 10 wackiest congressional actions on the Middle East is Lara Friedman, Director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. You ought to take a look at the website. You'll see the whole list and a whole lot more. APN is a great place to go for regular updates on what's happening in Congress. I want to, you know, when I looked at the list, I mean, I follow your stuff every week, the legislative update, and it's disturbing. But when you see the top 10 pulled out and you think, my God, this much damage was done in a year, it's wacky, but it's also very disturbing and makes you question whether or not the United States can ever play a meaningful role I mean, sometimes we sort of use the rhetoric of the U.S. should play a meaningful role, but when you look at this major institution of governance that is completely on the wrong side of everything in history, it's very tough, isn't it?
I mean, it's obviously tough. This is one year's top 10 list, and I use the word wacky not because I want to undercut the seriousness of it, but I think you have to have a little bit of a sense of humor or you go nuts. But this isn't unusual. I mean, we have every year, a lot of what Congress does is not about policy, it's about grandstanding, it's about point scoring, which certainly does have an impact. But by the same token, a lot of meaningful policy, a lot of progress has been made despite and sometimes with the help of Congress. So I don't despair of Congress, and I don't despair of the possibility.
Give me a for instance.
I mean, during the entire period of the Oslo Accords, I mean, that was a period where, I mean, a lot of the same legislation which is a problem now is old legislation which existed then, and members of Congress were under intense pressure from various elements of the American community to not support Clinton with the Oslo Accords, and yet they did pass legislation that allowed him to waive or to ignore or to overcome.
But that's the problem. I mean, I'm going to get to the list in a minute. Well, let's start with it. Let's take a look at the first. The first is to actually kill the waiver on Jerusalem. I mean, number one, the legislation to move the embassy was itself problematic and created riots. People actually lost their lives. But there was the waiver, and that made it not so bad because presidents could waive it. Okay. And now there's an effort not only to move the waiver, but to threaten to diminish the State Department's building and acquisition budget 50% if they don't move the embassy. What?
Well, I mean, for me, there's two pieces here. One is that Jerusalem is a hot button issue. For people who followed it, there's a case now in the Supreme Court on Jerusalem, where Congress has passed legislation as part of this sort of creeping effort to force U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, an official formal recognition. And the administration is saying the same thing that every administration before it has said, which is that this is a president's prerogative, it's executive prerogative, and they're fighting this in the Supreme Court. This is part of that. It's a very sensitive issue. It's sensitive for Jews, it's sensitive for Israelis. The question is, for me, I look at this through the political lens. Why is it that under 8 years of Bush, the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, were content letting the president have this waiver and use this waiver, and suddenly under Obama it is untenable. It is anti-Israel to use it and it is untenable to leave it there, which makes me see this as much more about politics than policy.
Let's take a look at the next one, and it has to do with the trying to shut the PLO office in Washington. Now, during the Oslo period, I remember very well, no sooner was the ink dry on the White House lawn signing ceremony than an effort was made to remove the anti-PLO legislation, which Congress ultimately balked at doing because AIPAC and others said no, do not go there. And so instead of getting rid of the legislation, they created a report writing
the Middle East Peace Facilitation Act
that required the State Department to submit this very detailed document on the PLO compliance, and they gave the president the waiver. The fact that that legislation is still there, the PLO...
Well, it isn't actually. It's interesting. They allowed MEPFA to expire.
But I mean the original legislation about the PLO being illegal and being a terrorist group, and so the waiver is there. But it's still there. And now there's an effort to kind of resuscitate the sanctions against the PLO and shut the office down, et cetera, if they don't behave.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I mean, meth was allowed to expire, and then Congress quietly stuck almost a secret. It was like a stealth waiver. It's in foreign ops every year. It's language that allows the president to waive the language that requires the PLO to be basically ejected from the U.S. And that, again, has continued. I make the point there was no effort to get rid of this waiver during the height of the anti-Arafat period. There was, the post-Camp David, there was no partner for peace. And now, I mean, the PLO is not on the terrorist list, hasn't been since 1991. It's fascinating to me that, like, the MEK, which is still on the terrorist list, can openly sort of fundraise and lobby in the U.S., but the PLO, because we're not happy with them as an organization, is going to be ejected from Washington potentially.
And the next one is
potentially
all the stuff going on about the UN and the PLO at the UN and its cutting aid to UNESCO for admitting Palestinians, and then threatening to suspend UN funding and portions of the amount. That was with the Goldstone report. It was whatever monies would be spent to produce the document and or to advocate for the document would be suspended. And then this recent letter by Steve Israel to suspend foreign military sales to any country that votes for the Palestinians. At what point does this become, could I use the term anti-American? I mean, does it compromise U.S. interests?
I mean, that's the point I make repeatedly in the list. I mean, historically, all of these waivers have been about U.S. interests, U.S. national security, important to U.S. interests. Congress has always, with all of the anti-Palestinian legislation, has always, kept in something which said the president, for the sake of U.S. interests, can do otherwise. Like they remember that ultimately that is the responsibility. So they can do so much pandering, so much retribution, but at the end of the day, we have to keep our interests in mind.
It's like a drunk driver knowing that at some point he has to give his keys to somebody.
I mean, it strikes me as interesting that in all of these cases, the U.S. interests, I wrote here, U.S. interests be damned, that seems to be the theme in a lot of what we've seen in the past year.
I remember John Conyers years ago when I, in my more naive days, said to him something about, don't these guys understand U.S. national interests? And he laughed and he said, from the first day they're elected, the national interests of the United States become synonymous with their re-election. That's all they think about.
I have to say, I don't agree with that. I mean, I've watched members, particularly quietly, fight to do the right thing. And that's why we had these waivers in the first place. I don't want to give them a pass for passing bad legislation, but that's why there's waivers in bad legislation.
Why does it get done? I mean, is it just AIPAC on the one side and the religious right on the other? Is it just politics? Is it ignorance? Is it a few people sort of steering traffic and the rest saying, look, I can't deal with this, just let it go?
I think it's all of the above. I think it's a different mood in the current Congress since the midterm elections. I think for both parties that the politics are so dominant, including the Republican Party, where, I mean, if you go down to, I don't mean to skip ahead to number 2, I mean, if you follow my roundups, you'll see a lot of Tea Party names in the roundup introducing legislation which is just wacky, introducing letters that are just beyond the pale of any serious policy, which are not things that AIPAC...
Or Louis Gohmert from Texas, who gives you a good piece of material every month.
Almost every week, yes. Yeah. I mean, these are not things that AIPAC supports. These are probably not things that even the ZOA supports.
I can't help but, we're running out of time, and I don't want to leave Anthony Weiner out. We have a little clip from the one you point to before he was drummed out, or actually finally had the dignity to leave. Here's a clip for Anthony Weiner saying one of the wackiest things this year.
Where you can see a difference in the development in the West Bank with 11% year-over-year growth, with no Israeli occupation there either, with increasing access to checkpoints. Lloyd, here's what maybe we should.
What about areas C, D, and E?
Hold on, hold on. Maybe this would be helpful.
No occupation in the West Bank.
Let me. Yeah.
I'm sorry, did I hear you right?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Have you
been to the West Bank?
Yes.
Recently? You didn't see the IDF there?
In Ramallah? No. In Nablus?
Ramallah is not the West Bank.
Now, can I tell you, there might be some people in this room who believe that Jerusalem is occupied territory.
Now, hang on a second. Let's stick with the West Bank.
I mean, there probably are.
You're saying that there is no IDF presence in the West Bank?
Yes.
The one I love is Brian Baird. It's Congressman Brian Baird sitting next to him, just absolutely in disbelief.
Yeah.
How many people are that blind?
I don't know. I think there are a lot of people on the Hill who don't know the issue well. I think most people on the Hill who are engaged, particularly among the Jewish members of Congress and the people who are engaged on foreign policy, do know the issue. My guess is that then Congressman Weiner was sort of in his loud talking mode and wasn't thinking carefully, because he has to know. I mean, he's not stupid. That there's IDF in the West Bank and that Israel has never annexed the West Bank. So even under Israeli law, it is defined as under belligerent military occupation. But there's a lot of the members of Congress who really don't follow this carefully and basically do what they're told.
So how does it change? Can it change? Will change come with or without Congress? Or is this just a fact of Washington political life that one has to deal with, and at best you work around it?
I'm going to go with all of the above. I think that it can change. I think we've seen Congress act responsibly. I have my doubts in the current, I mean, we're in an election cycle. Congress, it's always wacky season on the Hill during any election cycle. This presidential election cycle is particularly hot. And Israel has become a hot button issue, perhaps more so than in past elections. So I think it's going to get ugly in the next year or so. And I think, my prediction is that the Israeli government will undertake acts that make it even uglier. So I'm not optimistic in the short term. I do believe that when there is an engaged and serious White House, which then engages the energies of people in the region, including Israelis, it is very hard for Congress to get up and stop it.
That's all the time we've got. Thanks for joining us. Listen, check out the APN website. It is very worthwhile to do. If you want more information, you can follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA. Log on to the website, aaiusa.org. Wishing you a happy new year, and I'll see you next week on Viewpoint.